Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. And we start the second part of our one-day with Antiwar Coalition. My name is Antonina, and I, as well as my colleagues, is a member of curatorial team of the Antiwar Coalition of Cultural Workers Against the War. And we focus on our project is an online platform that collected, shared, and distributed and presented art statements that created artists all over the world. We focus on artists who had experience or have experience, unfortunately, of the war and repressions, because for us it's very important that large-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine is not only a separate event, but event event or terrible event that connected and involved globally all countries, because we cannot build democracy or any other just everyday life in isolated countries. So we invited artists, and some of the art statements of Ukrainian artists, as well as artists from other countries such as Turkey, Mexico, Great Britain, Germany, Poland, and so on. You can see on the wall in the screen, and as well we also try to we also not only online platform, but we have the so-called public tools, because for us it's very important to go in public, and we organize different exhibitions and discussions to try to collect it and share it and discussion our knowledge, and to try to rebuild new language and new theoretical frames to understand how we can live together and how we think about their situation. And today, usually we choose one topic and focus on it. And for documenta, we choose topic about the non-human agent during the war. It's very interesting topic for us, because usually non-human agents is not something or someone then on focus of public. And so, the second part, as I said, is a discussion. And I would like to, no, and I would like, before we start a discussion, I would like to say thanks our partners and our foundation is the ECF, European Cultural Foundation, and Goethe Institute. And and the moderator of this discussion is a Ukrainian curator, Natasha Chychasova. Natasha.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to see you today, and thank you for joining us for our discussion. I'll let bit explain the whole idea of our program for today. We want to split two different ways of how we can work with the topic of war, and especially non-human object and subject during a war, with the theoretical way. Uh, and for this reason, we invite the scientists and artists and people who engage in humanitarian science. And with a practical one, when we try to use the tool of art to speak about this painful and problematic topic. And the main focus of this discussion will be dedicated to the war, the Russian-Ukrainian war, and together with our participants, we will discuss it in more details and try to show you that Ukrainian-Russian war is not a local one, it's a global one. So firstly, I want to introduce the participants of our discussion for today. It's Alevtyna Kakhidze, a Ukrainian artist who as well have a residency in Musici in Kievan region. The Diana Lelonek, Polish artist based currently in Warsaw, and Nigel Clark, a professor of human geography at Lancaster University. So, our today's discussion will consist of three main parts. And first of these parts will be based on theory. And we want to little bit share and try to explain the terms which we'll use during the Alevtyna practical part of workshop, mainly which connect with invasive plants. And I want to ask my colleagues and participants how we can explain invasivity in a plant's world. What does it exactly mean? And moreover, how the humanity can use this term for their reasons and perspectives and somehow instrumentalize it for their political reason.
Hello. I interpret invasive plant as a plant which is taken from local place where it was growing since Ice Age till the humans, I would say, people, gardeners, took this plant and bring to totally another context. And this plant appeared to be naturalized. That means could manage to exist in new conditions without a gardener, without a help by people. And through the, if you theories which exist on invasivity can really like show the behavior which I would describe like domination through the local plants. How? Or for instance, this plant appeared in new context, on new climate zone, a new continent without nature enemies, which basically something like insects. Or for instance, another theory to invasivity that, for instance, it was or too wet or too dry, and it helps this plant to get a power. Or sometimes there is kind of intersection between invasive plant and something in new situation. So the theories of invasivity are few, and of course this plant which appeared to be very powerful and behaves like a bad guy, it's so much, of course, nothing to do with plant, but the question that people change the fate of this plant, and the plant appeared in the situation this is like behaves so badly, but of course not so much about plant itself. So this is my definition. trying to be not so plant phobic. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I wanted to pick up on what Alevtyna was saying, but I come from New Zealand, which is one of the places that has more invasive species than anywhere else. So for me, it's not just a question of what we can do with these terms, it's that they're very, very troubling terms, and they move backwards and forwards between the human world and the non-human world. Colonizer, colonizing plants, colonizing people, native and non-native, invasive species. Also the term refugia, which is a term for places where species survive difficult things like ice ages. So again, movement backwards and forwards, refugee, refugia. I think we have to be very, very careful with the way that these terms move backwards and forwards. Just to give one example, sometimes in the UK, ecologists talk about an invasive plant and it's a not native plant, and they'll take that plant into a schoolroom and they will drop the invasive non-native plant into the rubbish tin and say, you know, this is a bad plant. And for the children of migrant communities, this can be very, very disturbing to see that a migrant, a newcomer, a stranger gets, you know, dropped in the rubbish tin. So we have to be very, very careful, I think, with the way that these terms move backwards and forwards. But I think there's also kind of quite creative ways that we can kind of play around with these terms and do other things with them and, you know, mobilize them, which is another term that that moves backwards and forwards. But I think what a lot of it comes back to is the question of what belongs, who and what belongs in a place, who and what is a stranger, and who is someone who arrives more recently. I think there's some Aboriginal Australian tribes have a special phrase for a plant or an animal or bird that was a stranger but has now become, that now belongs to the land. So they have a special term for this. So it's possible to move from one to the other. And I think that that's really important to keep in mind, to try and blur that boundary between who belongs and who's a stranger.
Yeah, I agree. I would like to put one example. For example, Canadian golden root. This is a very invasive species in Poland, I think in Ukraine as well. And so we can easily call this plant as something bad. But from the other hand, in Canada, it was like a very important plant for indigenous people, and also is very helpful for bees. So this is not easy to say like invasive species are bad. It's so much very more complicated when we're talking about plants' behavior, because they are completely other kind of beings than humans. So this is always a problem when we transfer, when we make this parallel and transfer in between plant behavior and humans behavior. So this is always like a tricky thing. And these terms like invasive, like you already told that this all, I don't know, invasive species, no native species, etc., can be easy transfer, and we should be very careful about it. Yeah.
So maybe it will be interesting to tell our guests some maybe example of how this invasive term used for political reasons, for example, because I remember our previous discussion and Diana, for example, have very nice example of exhibition dedicated to invasive plants. So maybe you can tell more about this.
Yeah, I remember one exhibition. It was in Warsaw in, I think, 2017, and it was about migration of plants and plants that we call invasive, and it was put in the context of what usually right side politics say, that the migration crisis is like invasion, this nationalistic politics, say something like this. So on that exhibition, this metaphor was used to show how this right side politics use this term to in their own purpose. Yeah, I don't know if it was clear.
In New Zealand, again, it's very complicated because me being from Europe, I am one of the invaders. There's no way around that. But we also use another term that you will probably have heard of, which is feral. And feral means to be domesticated, but then to run away, to jump over the fence, and then to begin to naturalize yourself. So some of the artists I've worked with have really played with the idea of the feral, and they've explored the idea that all sorts of things, people, ideas, artistic ideas, arrive in a country, a new country, and they can jump over the fence and begin to rewild themselves and begin to transform in relation to the local landscape. So I think feral is also an interesting word to kind of play around with. And I know a lot of artists have found that a very useful concept to work with. It escapes some of the differences between native and non-native.
I also would like to add that there is also a difference in between this term invasive plant and migration of plants, because plants are always migrate because, for example, climate change right now. Like some species are moved more to the north because the climate change, or up to the mountains. They're trying to escape because the climate change pushed them to this migration. So this is also like plants are like it's it can be also like we don't think about plants as something that moving from one place to another, but they are also migrants. And I remember one example is Elden flower is living in Alps, and this is like, I don't know, traditional, like something very important in Switzerland, like it's like a Swiss national flower, let's say. But indeed, this is also like a climate migrant, because she came after ice era. She came to that part of Europe because the climate change. So this is also the question where we have these local plants. What is mean? If we go back to the ice era, it was like completely different ecosystem. So maybe these old plants somehow came. This is this term refugia you use, I think. It's about it. Yeah, but then we can maybe back also to this topic of climate change, that the war in Ukraine is also like connected with the climate change right now, because this all, or maybe we can talk about it later. Sorry.
Do you want to add?
But I still like to be not on a side human, to advocate human, that like we can just say that we are not responsible for appearance on invasive plants, because still the date for invasivity is very clear. This is really connected to, let's say, great discoveries. Columba time, when the new places were discovered and people started to use boat, and then they put plants on boat and take one plant, bring to another context, and then also from another context bring to another context, and it's actually started. And of course, the whole issue before this date, plants, they created really like so hard coexistence, and then humans like behave like teenagers. They just really like made chaos between plants. And of course, I also so much about be very sensitive and be very careful. This parallel, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. And of course, if we say migrant and invasive plants. It's absolutely different, because if to talk about potato, this is absolutely migrant because it's kind of tender plant or exotic plant and never can survive without the help of a gardener, let's say. But invasive plant, they also, uh, how to say, they also sometimes were in the situation, as you said, transition. So it was invasive, and then, for instance, insects arrived, which actually can consume their leaves, and they are more than less is under control. And then they are switch from the being invasive to just weedy one, or just to be naturalized one. I would say that politicians should really like know botanics better and not to scare kids and each other. And as my friend botanic says, that when some people with he said hammer and sickle is talking to him, he say no, 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 not for me with the hammer. You know, this kind of Soviet Union symbol, cycle and hammer. He said, no, 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 I'm not going to talk to any Marxist, no any socialist, no any political party. I really like to talk to botanists. This is maybe the best thing, just really like to talk in the circle that everyone is understand what they are talking about. And it must be really like white cube for discussion. It's not just to manipulate by poor plants. I wouldn't say poor plants.
So I propose you to switch on our second track of a discussion about the war. And when we have our previous discussion, I noticed that we speak about the one more term which a little bit related to plant and animals as well. It's world protection. When I hear this slogan of Alevtyna protection of local plants, which is absolutely positive, I remember the speech of the president of Russia Federation, Vladimir Putin, when he started the war in Ukraine and said that he wants to protect Ukrainians who Russian speaker, but now during the war he killed all of Ukrainians. It not depends on what language they speak. And for me, it's about the manipulation of this kind of, not the topic, but terminology as well, how they can affect. And I've noticed a lot then in the media, we often speak about the war between Russia and between Ukraine as a local conflict. That we just want to engage in it. It's so far from us. And this case is not only Ukrainian cases as well. We don't pay attention to a lot of different wars which presented now in a different parts of our continents. And that is why, for me, it's interesting to speak now with our participants how the war affects on the climate changes and how big impact they do on it. Because if you know, we live in a time of climate crisis still, and how the war can make this crisis worse.
Yeah, I can start. You don't mind? Yeah, I remember when I was in Kiev region when the whole-scale invasion happened. It was 24 February, and I spent like almost 40 days being in a cellar. And in that time, I read an article by Bruno Latour, and he wrote, so I received two bad news in the same day. The first news, the Russian-Ukrainian war started, and the second news, new data about climate change. And he wrote, I don't know, what is the worse? The news number one, where Russian-Ukrainian war started, or news number two, about the data on climate change. Be honest, I'm a Ukrainian artist, maybe not so many people here do know me, but I was so arguing with Bruno Latour being in a cellar. I was really pissed off, and I said, ha ha ha, if you really make a choice for Russian-Ukrainian war, it would be two tragedies in one. First of all, it's about violence between humans, and secondly, because it's so much really influence on the climate change. Why? Just know how it works. When the military vehicles, they destroyed fields and they make soil open, it immediately creates CO2 emits, right? It's bigger and bigger. Secondly, all the shellings, all the fire, all this erosion of soil, so many things which is actually so much about not to win a bit of climate change, but add more and more and more. So this is my answer.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like this is like really connected. Like, can you imagine how? I even cannot imagine how big this influence can be. Like the influence of war in Ukraine on the climate change, on the environment. I think like it's a global problem. Like we cannot think about war in Ukraine like something local that, or maybe that local ecosystem will be affected. No, I think it's really connected with other countries and in global circulation ecosystem and the climate change. This all toxic fuels, this all CO2, and also like we already also know that this is also like the beginning of global crisis with food. Like a lot of countries right now have problems because a lot of grains came from Ukraine, and there is a lot of countries who right now have really huge problems. So, of course, the war in Ukraine is like a global problem, and we are all should be aware that it's not just about local ecosystem.
For me, there's something really fascinating and intriguing about thinking about the relationship between humans and nature through war and conflict. But I also find that for me, it's very courageous when survival is at stake to also be thinking about the non-human species. But I mean, when you think about war, modern war, so much of it is about trying to undo the ecological infrastructure that people have, how they relate to non-humans. It's trying to unravel that. So in a sense, it's almost so often wars of colonization are trying to do genocide by way of ecocide. So if you can unravel and destroy someone's ecological infrastructure, how they live with other species, how they live with the earth, then you can really effectively do genocide in a different way. And it seems like most kind of colonial wars are like that in some way. And then, of course, when you unravel that, when you start to take that apart, then you get people who are dislocated, then you get famine, then you get disease, you get pathogens coming in. I think it's also to think about that in terms of climate as well. Once you've unraveled somebody's ecological infrastructure, they are then very, very vulnerable to weather events, to changing seasons, to extreme weather events, whether it's monsoons or cyclones or anything like that. They then become very, very vulnerable. And also, of course, much, much more vulnerable to climate change. So you kind of have climate change on both ends. You have the military, which makes climate change so much worse because they are huge carbon emitters as well as causing ecological destruction. But then the wars actually make people so much more vulnerable to climate change because their ecological infrastructure has been unraveled. So that makes it very, very complex. But I think it makes it so important to think war through non-human agency because they are inseparable. They're so hard to tease apart.
For me, when I think about the war in Ukraine as well, I always think about the west part of Ukraine which became about east part of Ukraine, which now is the most affected territory during the war. And this territory was started occupied since 2014. And this region of Ukraine is the most industrial, powerful places, but unfortunately not so, because it was the it was a heritage. Thank you so much. It was a heritage of the Soviet time, and we need, as Ukrainians, we need to rebuild this territory very well. But now it was one of the most polluted area in Ukraine as well. And unfortunately, because of the occupation, the Ukraine have no possibility to deal with this problem. And all things will happen in this occupation territory is not under our control. It makes it worse and make a global problem not only for Ukraine but all over the world. Especially there are another huge cases about the influence of war in Ukraine on the whole ecosystem is as well the case when the Russian military forces bombed the nuclear plant in the Zaporizhzhia region, which is much bigger than Chernobyl. And if it's bombed, we have a huge problem which we need to deal together. So that is one of the main reason to stop this war. And not to finish our discussion on all the pessimistic ways, we want to explain and show you some cases when non-human agents become then really agents and can help us to survive and recover our lost territories. And main question as well, if the humanity want to lead on them or not, but it's our decision, but I hope it will be. Can you tell us some positive example of how non-human agents can help us to recover our land after the stopping of war?
I have some examples. I need to see my notes. I have some examples from history. Like one is the story about beavers. There is one artistic work by Aurelia Magnite, partisan of landscaping, and she is an artist from Latvia. She made the research around beavers. And during the Soviet occupation in Latvia, they made regulation of rivers and made melioration system and canals. And as you know, nowadays it's very important to renaturalize rivers. So some countries put a lot of money to make this renaturalization of rivers, but beavers started to do it independently. So they started to deconstruct and change these canals made by Soviets and put them back to this natural ecosystem. So I think there is a lot of examples where non-human beings can be really agents in recovery of ecosystem. The second example, which is for me like very amazing example, it's about Vakaresti Natural Park in Bucharest. So there was a big plan by Ceausescu to make huge water collector, and they started to do it, put concrete around, built a big hall, put concrete around, but then system change. Ceausescu was killed, and after 89, this place stayed abandoned. And during 30 years, the nature back, the many species back there, and started to recover this ecosystem themselves independently. And in 2014, there was decision that this place should be a nature reserve. So this abandoned, destroyed area covered by concrete became nature reserve because plants and animals did it independently. So, just because this space stayed abandoned, because there was some, I don't know, there was some plans for new investitions, but they failed. And yeah, so fortunately for plants and animals. And also we was talking about invasive species, but I also would like to mention ruderal plants, like pioneer plants, this kind of weeds that can appear as first in destroyed, damaged, toxic areas and can prepare the ground, the poor soil, for more species. So they are often very popular kind of species, and we even don't know how important they are. Like, for example, Artemisia vulgaris, pioun, palin, in English common mugwort, and for example, this one can appear as a first and recover the ground. So I think we can also learn from these plants somehow, like, or maybe just sometimes just give them space to overgrow. Yeah, I don't know.
Thanks, Diana. I haven't got an example that's anywhere as good as the beavers, but there's a case again in New Zealand where I'm from where Europeans introduced gorse, so that nasty spiky plant that is often used as a hedge in the United Kingdom. So they introduced gorse to use it as hedges to separate paddocks. So of course the first thing the gorse does is it runs wild. It turns into an invasive plant and it begins to take over the whole paddock because it doesn't want to just be a fence. But then much later on, and the gorse caused a whole lot of problems for farmers. But then later on, they realized that the gorse was causing so much trouble that some farmland was actually being taken out of production. But that was actually a good thing because the farmland was causing really bad erosion. So then they discovered that native plants, native trees were growing underneath the gorse. So when you have a lot of gorse, the gorse serves as a shelter for the small native saplings, and then they grow into bigger trees. So it turned out that by mistake, the gorse was actually supporting the regrowth of the native forests. So you ended up with ecologists, environmentalists, who would get great big parachutes full of gorse seed, and they would take them up to the worst, most erosive farmland that shouldn't really have been there, that was causing erosion. And in the middle of the night, they would spread gorse seed all over the farmland, and then the gorse would take over, and then gradually the native trees would begin to grow under the shelter and the shade of the gorse. So just to say that sort of complicatedness between what belongs and what doesn't belong, between what's invasive and what is feral, but also between the invasive and the natural. I think there's real kind of lessons there about, partly about shelter and about hospitality, but also that sometimes these things can be quite accidental and they can take us by surprise. And that's maybe something we can learn from plants.
Yeah, I would like to mention that I'm from a country where we had this catastrophe, Chernobyl, and 30 years has already gone, but on the edges of the zone which was polluted, we have received eventually something which was restored. Yeah, and it's just amazing space to learn how nature can restore or hill itself. So be honest, I'm so crazy and angry about the war, because actually I had the plan to go to see this area in Chernobyl, how the local plants managed to survive and they are invasive or not, how they deal. It's just amazing to come there. And I'm really like dreamed that the war would be ended and I would do what I planned before the invasion started. And I really ask everyone to come. And I also mentioned one more thing which can help us to fight against the climate change. So being even in a cellar for 40 days, I was reading so much about Vavilov, you know, the scientist from the Soviet Union era, who actually, if you just check the Wikipedia in Russia, it would be Russian Soviet, but basically he did work a lot in Ukraine, and he was so much related to discovery and experiment on perennial wheat, perennial grain. And what does it mean? If we are really smart enough, I mean all human civilization, and we really like can develop his experiments in North of America, in Kansas State, agricultural hub, which called the Land Institute. They already created perennial wheat, which called Kernza, so it already exists. So if we replace our fields with perennial wheat instead of annual wheat, we will really gain a lot of less CO2 emits to atmosphere. So this is what we have to put our energy. If we need to grow some wheats or grain or any species for food, we try to do them actually perennial. And there is already perennial rice, there is already perennial flour which could be used for oil. So I would really like say perennial species for food is just our hope. I really call everyone, just ask politicians, what do you think about perennial wheat? Would you like to have some program or something like this? So this is how nature can help us to fight against the climate change, which is important for all of us. Thank you.
Yeah, and one more which I want to add is the pickles as a way, because the pickles is one of the most sustainable way to conserve a food and preserve the food. And we as Ukrainians know a lot about the pickles, and it was really helpful for us during the full Russian invasion started, that we can feed ourselves and don't go to the market. And for other hand, it helps us to focus on the local plants as well and try to grow our food by ourselves. And as well, for me, it's a good way and possibility for not only for Ukraine, but also for all over the world for the food sustainability. And we can try to exchange about this knowledge together. So our discussion is end to now. And I want to ask our audience, if you have some question, you can ask it to our participants. If you want to share some interesting example related to our topic, we will be glad to hear you. No question. So, okay, thank you very much for your attention. We continued our program in 1 hour. No, in 3 hours, sorry. In 3 p.m., we meet here for our next workshop of Belarus group EFFF, which dedicated to algorithmic solidarity. So see you soon, and 3 hours. Have a rest and have a good day.